All right, thanks very much. My name's Jay. I'm an architect at Eyefinity, which is the software division of Vision Service Plan. If you're employed here in the US and your employer offers vision coverage, chances are you're covered by VSP. Our team writes the software to make that happen. We're big fans of the Atlassian products, and we've got a pretty good sized Confluence and JIRA running. And what I wanted to talk about was disposable testing environments, and we do this in our products, but it turned out to be something very useful in the administration of Confluence and JIRA itself. So I wanted to walk you through what we learned and discovered over the last year or so. So I'll start with a rhetorical question. What does your Confluence sandbox look like? Imagine you have production and you have something that's not production. And you might actually have multiple not productions. And there's different reasons that we have them, but chances are you've got some place where you can try some things and you're not going to hurt anyone. Something that is a little more disposable, you can spin it up and spin it down. So there's production and there's not production. And what I'm going to walk you through is a discussion of this thing that's not production. The closer we get it to being just like production, the better. It's going to answer some questions for us, it's going to solve some problems for us, and that's what I'm going to walk you through. So the path to making a production sandbox will evaluate your current sandbox, and if it's not close to production, we'll talk about it can still be useful, but maybe not as useful. There could be some problems with it, and there's some questions you can't answer if you have a non-production sandbox. I'll give you the scenario that we had to go through. It was kind of a double whammy that kind of led us to use this path as our administrative path for Confluence. Talk about the benefits of disposable production sandboxes. Some gotchas in using a production copy. You don't get it for free, so there's things that you have to take into account. And then some suggestions for successful sandboxes. If you do this approach, here's some best practices that you can follow going forward. All right, so back to the rhetorical question about what your sandbox looks like. We could end up with this non-production Confluence in a number of different ways. Maybe it was your testing staging attempt, or maybe it's what you installed the first time before doing it for real. I know I kept the standalone version running on the H2 database around for quite a while and was able to run that on my laptop, and it was helpful. I could spin this thing up, spin this thing down, go try something real quick, and knowing that I'm not going to hurt anybody or hurt the production Confluence. And so you might have one of those laying around or multiples of those laying around. Maybe you're running a private Confluence just for us admins, right? There's a meta Confluence. There's a Confluence everybody else in the company uses. And then you might have your own Confluence that you have a team use. Again, it might be the early adopter Confluence. You might put plugins there to help evaluate with the smaller team before it goes out to the larger team. Maybe it was a restore from a backup. There could have been a problem at one time. You restored the backup somewhere, and you just never shut that down. And since the backup's kind of like a copy of production, maybe you kept it. And this is the closest scenario to what I'm going to suggest, but there's still problems with just restoring from a backup all the time. And then maybe you have a leftover instance from a prior team. Could have been multiple Confluences running in your business. Maybe you consolidated some over time or just abandoned one over time, and that abandoned one is still there. So chances are you have a non-production sandbox. It probably got created one way or another. They're kind of laying around, the flotsam and the jetsam of the history of your Confluences. But what I'm going to try to walk you through is, as useful as these non-production sandboxes are, you probably want to get as close to production, if not exactly production, going forward to help answer some bigger questions. So first, let's talk about the usefulness of your non-production sandboxes. It's a good place to try your plugins. So maybe this is where you started your non-production in the first place. You wanted some place to evaluate some commercial plugins before you committed to a purchase. Or even if it's a free plugin, you wanted to try it and see if it made sense inside your Confluence. So a non-production sandbox can help with this, and that's probably one of the big reasons you have one now. Playing around with permissions, you might create some profile type users and want to try different permission schemes to see what the visibility looks like. Should we be able to open up private spaces? Should we keep private spaces private? How can we keep this team from seeing that team's stuff? Thinking about themes, if you've got different skins that you want to put on there or different themes for each space, it's a good place to practice those out. And then just the general what ifs. So a non-production sandbox can help answer those. It's useful in these areas, but you're missing out on a whole bunch of other benefits by not having something that is production. What you're missing out on is a possibility to undo a mistake. So this might go back to your restoring of a backup. Let's say something major happened in your production Confluence and you need to undo that mistake. Well, first you have to understand what the mistake was and how it happened. If you're running a dev shop, that's what your developers do, right? First thing you want to do is reproduce it so you can understand it, and then you can go back and you can fix it. Maybe that's the restore of your backup, where that came from, because you can really only do this in a production sandbox. If you have a non-production sandbox, chances are it doesn't have the complexity, it doesn't have the volume of the information in it that really emulates what happened in production. So if you really want to know what happened there, you need something as close to production as possible. Along with investigating a problem, if a user says, I do this, I do this, I do this, and it doesn't do what I expected it to do, having a copy of production can help you out for the same reasons as a non-production sandbox may not be able to answer that for you because it doesn't have the exact same version of the plugins, or there's some other kind of interaction going on. Understanding upgrades. This is the big one. You want to take your Confluence from one version to another version. It's a complicated maneuver. And if you really truly want to understand what that upgrade path is going to look like for you when it comes time to do it for real in production, you're going to want production to do that on, not just this other side Confluence that you have over on the side that doesn't exactly reflect all the complexities of production. And then what to expect when you make this change for real. You go through some kind of space change, you go through some kind of permission change, you go through upgrades. You want to know what that's going to look like in production when you're all done. In fact, you might even want it to know what it looks like so you can give tips to the users on here are the changes that you're going to notice once the upgrade's all done. And so you can't get those things on the right with a non-production Confluence. And so what I'm going to do is build the case for creating a production sandbox and describing how we do it in our shop, which should be something you should be able to emulate as well. All right, so let's get to the scenario that drove us to do this. We all have different war stories, but this is the impetus of thinking about this type of production sandbox that we found most useful for the following scenario. Started innocent enough. We had more than one Confluence inside the organization. There was one I'll call the critical mass Confluence. It's the one the vast majority of the company use. There's another team that had their own Confluence, and for reasons that made sense at the time, they were running their own Confluence. They were free to create their own users and create their own spaces. And of course, some of the argument went along, well, it's going to be limited to just this one team. Nobody else is going to need to get into it. It's going to be safe to have these two different Confluences. And we know how useful Confluence is and how sticky it can be. And pretty soon we were getting double requests for user creation. We needed a user created in the critical mass Confluence and a user created in this other team Confluence. And we quickly realized the cross-pollination between the two was starting to get out of control. Fielding lots of questions of, well, go find this in Confluence. No, the other Confluence. We quickly realized we needed to take that team and get them moved over into our critical mass Confluence. All right, so it came time to do this. Let's go check the Confluence documentation on how to do it. And it's not exactly easy to do this. And this isn't really a dig on Confluence, but it's a fact of life that if you want to go muck with a space, rename it, clone it, move it, there's really no easy first-class way to do it. In the documentation, it's got these warnings about this copy space plugin, and it's got two warnings. So didn't leave me with a warm fuzzy that this would be something I could just fire and forget and it would work the first time. There's another option down there of manually cloning and renaming a space. This one I was a little more comfortable with, just being a developer. I can go look at some kind of structured text file, go find the things in there that I need to change, go change it, and try and import, and hopefully it worked. That's the option that I ended up electing to do, was taking this export, running some awk scripts on it, replacing the things I needed to replace, and getting it moved over. But it didn't stop there. At the same time, since I was going to have to schedule some downtime for our production Confluence, it made sense to work on the upgrade of our Confluence version. We were running a version before 3.5, and we wanted to move up to a version 4. And you can't get there from here. You have to go from a pre-3.5 to 3.5, and then you can go from 3.5 to 4. And so that meant I had to do this upgrade twice. Actually, 4 times, because you need to bring your plugins up to date, get your engine up to date. Now I'm at 3.5, and then do it again to get up to the target 4 whatever version. And I think this slide's already out of date. They've got a couple of minor revs even since I created this one. So keeping up to date with the upgrades can be a bit of a chore, and if you let it get too stale, you could end up with more work to do. And that was going to be a hard thing for us to swallow, and it was risky. So there's 2 risky operations I needed to do, which is a perfect excuse to have a sandbox. And really it was a series of risky operations just in 2 camps. One camp was move the space over, the other camp was perform these upgrades, and I needed a safety net to do these in, so I knew what to expect and how to undo it or redo it if something really went wrong. So there's some big questions that really only a production environment can answer for you. How much downtime is needed for this maintenance? Our Confluence had reached critical mass within the organization. We have users from multiple time zones using it. There's really not a lot of downtime where I can sneak something in while they're not looking. I need to schedule downtime to do this. So then the next question is, how much downtime do I need? I don't know. Is it a lunchtime thing? Is it an after hours thing? Do I need to schedule a weekend for this? I don't know. If I have a side Confluence that's not exactly like production, it's not necessarily going to give me the answer that I need to understand how long this upgrade is going to take. What order should I do these things? Does it make sense to bring the space in first and then do the upgrades, or do I do the upgrades and then the space? The 2 Confluences I was moving around were on different versions, so should I do even an interim upgrade, bring the space over, then continue the upgrade? There were lots of questions, and there might be shortcuts in there. I didn't want to discover those shortcuts while I was trying to do it for real, so I needed a safety net to be able to do this. What do I do if it all goes wrong? If I'm doing this for real in production and something goes wrong, now I need to explain to everybody why Confluence isn't available. Also, what's it going to look like when it's all done? Moving this space across, because the other Confluence, we allow the team to create their own names and their own space names. The name of the space wasn't quite to the standard that we wanted in our critical mass Confluence, so I was changing the name of the space as I was moving it across. I wanted to make sure that works. It'd be nice if I could give the folks a screenshot of here are the new spaces, including your renamed space right here so you can find it. It'd be nice to have something prepared ahead of time to be able to give the users so they know what to expect. And then it's a confidence builder for me. Does it look the way I expect it to look? Is the space named right? Are all the plugins right? Do they still work? Are we up to the version that I expect it to be? So how do I know when I'm done? How do I know, does it look the way I expect it to when I was done with this operation? So there's a saying we have inside of our development shop, and it's true for Confluence and JIRA, and it's true for the products that we make as well, and that there's nothing like production except production. You spend a lot of time trying to build load test environments, you spend a lot of time trying to emulate production, and there's a lot of effort that goes into that. But there's truly nothing like production except production and all the idiosyncrasies, what the users do to it, and everything else. And so the closer you can get to production, the better. And we decided to do the same thing with our Confluence. And by the way, we do the same thing with our JIRA instance as well. So if I haven't made the case with you yet, production provides answers for you. It gives you production-sized database. If you need to do a re-indexing operation, it's nice to know how long that's going to take and what's truly involved and how hard is it going to hammer the database by running it on a production instance or near production instance. Production-sized attachments, you don't want to forget about your attachments directories. Production-sized complexity, and of course any production-sized problems. So setting up your sandbox, you have different elements to your Confluence. There's a servlet container in the web app, and whether you run the standalone version or if you run it as a true war or ear inside of another servlet container, that's one component of your sandbox. Another component is the database itself. And then, of course, you don't want to forget your Atlassian home directory, which has your attachments, it has indexes, and lots of other important things. Because there are three pieces to this, you have options on how you can implement your instance of Confluence. These three pieces can be installed on different servers. You can have your war running inside of a bigger servlet container, or it can be in a standalone servlet container. Your database could be on the same machine. It might be on a different machine. Maybe your DBAs like to consolidate the databases into a bigger instance that happens to be running multiple schemas in there. And then, of course, your Atlassian home could also be on a network-attached storage and just shared back to your Confluence instance. In our shop, I'll say we were lazy, and it turned out to be helpful. Better way to say lazy was we started with the simple and could add the complexity when it came time to add the complexity. So when we first set up Confluence and it turned into our critical mass Confluence, we did it on a single server. So in the same server, we have Tomcat as our container, running Confluence, a MySQL database there on the same machine, and Atlassian home is a local drive on there. And it ended up buying us a lot more than we expected. We knew that if the complexity came up, if database performance was an issue or anything else, we could move these pieces apart when the time came to move them apart. And it turned out that that was helpful. If we had introduced complexity by moving things apart first, this picture here would be slightly different, but it's not impossible. So I'm going to reference back to this here in a couple of minutes when we're talking about how to make a production instance or a copy of production so that you can run it. If it's a single server instance like this, it makes it a lot easier. If you have it broken apart, there'll be a little more work to do. You'll just have to coordinate keeping all those pieces in sync. Not impossible, just a little more work. So because we were just a little bit lazy, or let's say efficient, we were efficient in keeping everything on one server. We had another stroke of luck. We were running it in a virtualized machine. And this is really where the benefit has come in. Some of you are also running VMs, I'm sure, and you might have already jumped ahead and figured out. In fact, you're probably doing some of this already. But if not, the rest of this is going to be some arguments for you to think about a virtualized environment or using your virtualized environment in a way that gives you a copy of your production environment easily and fast. So Confluence can't run in a VM. You read the Confluence documentation and they've got their favorite VM environment that it can run in. I don't want to start any religious wars over which VM environment to use, but what I'm going to describe is generally available in any of those hosting environments. Big benefit is you can make a copy of the entire machine. So kind of back to that single server instance. I get a copy of my servlet container, my web app, my database, and my Atlassian home directory all at the same time, which is huge. If I had those pieces spread across other servers, I would need to take snapshots at nearly identical times, or at least identical enough times, to make sure those three pieces were in sync when it came time to reconstitute them somewhere else. By being efficient, having one server that was already a VM, we can easily make a copy of that entire machine. It makes an exact copy, which is a blessing and a curse. I'm going to cover some of the curses here in just a few minutes. But having an exact copy of your production machine is beneficial, but it doesn't come for free. You'll have to do a little bit of work. Taking snapshots turned out to be a really nice benefit. If any of you are gamers and you're used to playing your favorite game and you just discovered that big power-up or that big weapon and you reach the save point, now you can go tackle the boss of that level, and if you die, you just roll back to your latest save point and try it again. You can do the same thing here. Since I had a multi-step process to go through in copying a space across and doing multiple upgrades to get us up to the version that I wanted to get to, I wanted to be able to save at certain points so I didn't have to roll all the way back and repeat all the steps again going forward. You can take snapshots in most of the VM hosting environments, and it's a copy of that entire machine at the time that you took the snapshot. Very, very helpful, and lets you roll back and kind of set up your work in stages so you don't lose everything and have to start all over at the beginning. Kind of a side feature of this was, since you can take snapshots and you can use them to roll back if you made a mistake, it might even be a legitimate backup strategy for you. Depending on your hosting environment, if taking a snapshot is fairly quick, that could be your backup. You can just take exact copies of your machine, have them stored off, and it might be easier than trying to take backups of the database or the file system with some kind of diffing tool, especially if you have the space on your network to do that. So here are some gotchas. So if we're going to use a virtual environment and we're going to make a copy or a clone of that virtual environment, there are some gotchas that come along with that. The first one is IP addresses and ports. It makes an exact copy of your machine, including IPs and ports. Chances are you don't want to reconstitute that clone of your production environment with the exact same IP address. Bad things happen, unless you're behind some kind of sophisticated internal natting process. But most VM host environments will give you the opportunity to go change things about the environment before you fire it up. Don't forget to change your IP address and your ports. One of the environments that we clone this way is multi-homed. It has multiple IP addresses bound to the net card. So in the configuration of JIRA and Confluence, not only are we binding to ports 8080 and 8443, we're binding to an IP address, port 8080 and 8443. So don't forget about that. It's on my checklist. Every time we clone, I've got a script that can go do that, which is handy, but you'll discover this pane, work through the pane, write it down so you don't forget it the next time that you go to do this. Plugins. I've got to give you an embarrassing story that I had when we did this with JIRA. We have the plugin installed that you can comment on a JIRA issue via email, which is great for your non-technical users. They can weigh in on a comment on a JIRA issue, or a JIRA user that, or somebody in your company that doesn't have a JIRA license, you can still have them comment on a JIRA issue. So we did this in a JIRA environment, cloned it, reconstituted it one morning. Everything was running fine. Went to lunch, had lunch with a couple of the developers, and they were complaining about email. They said it seemed like email was slow because they were commenting on JIRA issues, but the comments weren't showing up in JIRA. Other guys said, no, some of the comments are showing up, just not all the comments. I had a sneaking suspicion, so when I came back from lunch, I went and looked at production, and sure enough, some of the comments are there, but some of the comments they mentioned that were missing were not there. I went to the clone JIRA environment, and that's where I found them. Turns out that both JIRAs were going and pinging the same JIRA email box. And if the production JIRA got there first, everything was fine. If the test JIRA got there, those comments were appearing in the test JIRA, or worse, they were on issues that didn't exist yet in the test JIRA, and we're getting error messages saying I couldn't find that particular issue. So that was a little embarrassing. I learned that lesson. That one's on the script now as well, to go change any plugins that we have. Kind of related to that are base URLs. Another embarrassing moment from Confluence. When we make a clone of Confluence, sometimes we're using it for a test, and we'll create persona users, right? We'll have Devin developer and Sally sales or somebody. And as a general rule, I don't like to know passwords of the users. So when we create users in our Confluence, and we're not using crowd yet, that's a different story, but just using the default user manager inside of Confluence, create the user, put in a bogus password, assign them to the right groups, and then I'll go use the forgot password feature to have an email sent out to the user with the link of how to go reset your password. That way, I don't have to tell them what their password is. They can go set it for themselves the first time. So in this test Confluence that I set up, we set up these profile users, and I wanted to email those out to the few folks who were going to do some testing. Forgot to change the base URL defined inside of Confluence, so that the email dutifully went out, but the link inside the email was back to the production Confluence. So they would click on the link, they would go try to log in as Sally Sales or Devin Developer, and it didn't work. And that's also on my list. So each time you do this, you might discover some quirks. Put it on your list so that you don't forget it next time. Trusted applications might also be an issue. If you've got your Confluence talking to your JIRA talking to your Confluence, and you've got very specific instance names, DNS names or IP addresses, you'll want to change those as well. So you do get an exact copy of your environment, but there's work to do because it is an exact copy of your environment. Of course, I keep talking about copies like space is free. We know from the consumer side how cheap hard drive space is, but I'm sure your network attached storage guys don't think hardware space is free. So another gotcha of having so many VMs is it can take up some space. So make sure you talk to your network attached storage folks early, let them know what you plan to do. That way they can plan accordingly and make sure you have the space that you need to do your snapshotting and your backups and your what ifs. So some suggestions for running your copy of production sandbox. Use a very different URL or name or port number. I want to make sure that there's no confusion between this parallel universe production Confluence and the real production Confluence. The worst thing I can see happening is somebody forgetting or having a bookmark to what they thought was production, they ended up in a non-production. If you use a very different name, maybe use non-standard port numbers. Most of the time, for us, our test of Confluence is for some kind of administrative test, or there's going to be a small group of users testing. It's not really meant for consumption by the whole company. So it's okay if it's a little bit harder to get to, and a little bit harder meaning it's got a fairly unique name, or it's got some non-standard ports. I might rotate those non-standard port numbers, so if somebody did bookmark the old one, they can't get to the new one. Just make it a little more difficult to get there so they don't get there by accident. If they do get there, whether on purpose or by accident, another best practice would be to put some kind of announcement banner on there, some custom HTML at the top of your page that screams out that this is not production. Because if they did end up there and it looked a lot like production and they thought it was production and they start putting in more content and you throw it away because it wasn't production, the person who created all that content might not be too happy. So bring back the blink tag or put it in red, whatever you have to do, but let the users know you're in a parallel dimension production. You might even put the date that it was created in there, so if they're looking for particular content, they know that, well, if that content was created after this date, it's not going to be there. Also, try to match your production performance, whether it's better or worse. So if you're on a VM and your host, you could go one of two ways. Maybe your production host is built out, you're good stewards with the resources that host has, and so it performs very, very well. You take your copy and you put it on a different host. That host may not perform quite so well. So when you do your testing and your timing, you'll need to do the math on the time of, well, it took this long on this other machine that's 20% slower. Does that equate to a 20% time difference if you get ready to schedule this for production? Well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. You'll have to test that out. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe your production host is busy and you've got a non-production host and you move your VM over to the non-production host and it performs much better. It's great for things like re-indexing because they're going to run faster, but again, you're going to have to do the time math on how long is this really going to take in production, right? My non-production environment performs way better than my production. Do I know how much downtime I need for production? No. So if you can, try to match the performance level between your production and your non-production to answer those questions like how much time is this thing going to take. And then the key here is to automate this as much as possible. So kind of going back to the restore of the backup, it was probably a one-time event. Hopefully you didn't have to do it more than once. And it was probably a lot of work. Creating your VMs, particularly with the checklist of the things you have to change, like port numbers and host names and plugins, you're going to want to automate that as much as you can. You can automate the VM snapshotting from your host. You can run shell scripts, Puppet, Chef script kind of things to go change the configuration of your of either JIRA or Confluence or even your servlet container config files. Try to automate it as much as you can. That'll make you allow you to use it more often so that this becomes more of a pattern and a habit versus a one-off thing that you do. Once you make this easy to do, it's easy to do, and you'll find other excuses and other reasons that you can create a copy of production very quickly to practice your upgrade or to do some what-if scenarios, and then you can throw it away when you're done. So if I haven't convinced you yet, benefits of having your sandbox be production, in fact, an exact copy of production buys you a lot. You get snapshots and rollbacks by running in a virtualized environment. We're comfortable running Confluence and JIRA in virtualized environments. We really haven't noticed any performance problems that are attributable to the application. There might be other environmental things that happen, but JIRA and Confluence itself for us performs just fine in our virtualized environment for us. So if you're not on a VM yet, might consider it. Most of the hosting, the VM hosts, have a tool that will convert your existing environment into a virtualized machine so you can run on a VM. So it's not like you have to reinstall. You can just kind of automatically clone from physical to virtual and run from there. By having a disposable VM and a copy of your production environment, you can write a cookbook and have repeatable steps. So if you have a multi-step process, like copying a space across or having to do upgrades of versions, you can build your checklist. 1, 2, 3, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. Once you have your cookbook, you can rehearse your upgrade. Easy way for us to do that is I can hand that cookbook to somebody else. They can get a copy of production. They should be able to follow the same steps that I wrote down and produce the same results. And if I forgot to put something in the cookbook, they'll discover it because they'll say, I got to this step and you didn't tell me what to do next and I got lost. It helps build confidence that the steps you're trying to go through in your operation, copying spaces, doing upgrades or whatever, that you've documented everything you need to do so you're ready to do it for real in production. Record the timing of your steps. You can answer those production questions. And like I said, it gives you confidence that when it comes time to do this for real, you've already done it a few times. You know exactly how long it should take. You know exactly what this is going to look like in the end. And you can throw your disposable production environment away when you're done and make a new copy of production. So hopefully I've convinced you or maybe given you some ammunition to go back to your shop and talk about virtualized environments and how to make a copy of production. But I wish you luck in your Confluence and your JIRA, and I hope you have a good time. Thanks.